Okay, I've progressed a little bit towards this disassembly of the upper intake plenum so that I can get to the number one fuel injector, which is underneath. So the fuel injector looks like this guy, except it's on the wrong side of the engine, the inaccessible side of the engine that I have to get to. So one of the things that we have to do is disconnect all the lines. There's a number of electrical connectors, and there are lots of vacuum lines, and there's throttle body cables that have to be disconnected. And you can see that I've now labeled all of them. So where there was a male end, I've labeled the one end with an A. The female end I've labeled with an A, so I know that those two A's go together. So you can see there are A lines, B vacuum lines. This happens to be the power brake booster vacuum. There is this D line corresponds to this D port down here. There was this C line that went to this port right here. And it's important, I took a couple of still pictures of the orientation of all these lines, because you can see how this vacuum line comes over the top of this one, and it pretty much, and then it connects to the throttle body right there. So I've labeled both of these with an E. And that orientation is important because it's not going to go back together very well if you try and put this C line on top of the E line. Also, I've chosen to actually label with words some of the connectors, such as this little bracket. I've labeled it upper TB, as in upper throttle body, so it goes on this bolt right here. And I've labeled this electrical connector side TB, in other words side of throttle body, so it goes to a connector down in there, and so forth. So next we're going to take off the throttle cables, and those are a little tricky. You just have to know how to do it, and it becomes easy. Here are your throttle cables right there, and they connect to this apparatus. First thing we want to do when we're going to loosen the throttle cables is loosen these two 10mm bolts to the throttle cable bracket so we can make some slack down there. And also they're going to have to come off anyway in order to take out the intake plenum and the throttle body, which is attached to it. No need to disconnect the throttle body by itself, it stays on the plenum. Okay, I'm now ready to disconnect the throttle body cables, which the first time I did it, it was a little perplexing to me as to how it came apart, but it's really quite simple. And we're going to zoom in here just a little bit, and the throttle bodies, the throttle cables, which are essentially your accelerator cables, they connect to this cam-like mechanism. So there you can see the cam, and there's two of these cables, and so there is a little slot on the back end of this cam mechanism, and basically what you have to do is rotate the cables over to the slot and then flick them out like that. Okay, and I'm doing this one-handed. It's very easy to do if you have two hands free, but I'm holding the camera. So you have to get the cable over to the slot, and then you can slide it sideways. And I may not be able to do this with one hand on the second cable, so I'm probably going to have to turn the camera off and do this off camera. So that's what I'll do. Okay, now you can see that both of the throttle cables are free, and they're off of this cam assembly, which you can see how it rotates, and it basically opens the butterfly valve inside the throttle body to let the air in. So we're almost all the way disconnected on this side. There are a couple more things that we've got to do that I'm going to disconnect. You'll come upon those and see what has to happen. There's a couple of smaller bolts. The big thing that has to happen, or maybe the trickiest, and I'm not sure you're going to be able to see it, But underneath this throttle body, way in there, right about here, is an EGR connection tube. So EGR is exhaust gas recirculation. That tube comes off of the exhaust pipe and feeds hot exhaust gas back into this throttle body or intake plenum throttle body combination just aft of the butterfly valve, or downstream from the butterfly valve. And that EGR tube has to come out, or has to be disconnected at the throttle body because otherwise it won't come out. So we're going to work on that. The other thing we're going to work on is disconnecting this upper alternator mount bracket. So we don't have to take out the whole thing. The alternator, I think, can stay, but just this triangular bracket right here is connected by one screw here, or one bolt, and a second bolt here, a third bolt there, and this mounting screw. So 4 bolts, I guess, total have to come out in order for this bracket to come away from the intake plenum to make that able to come off. The other thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take off this coil assembly that has all of the spark plug wires connected to it. We just basically have to disconnect it here with these 2 10mm bolts from the intake plenum, and I think we can just leave it lie on top of the engine. It doesn't have to go anywhere, and we'll go from there. Okay, here we've got a shot of the intake, or the alternator mounting bracket. I've taken out the 4 bolts. They're sitting right there in my magnetic tray in the same orientation that I took them out. And so now we'll get a close-up of that bracket. You can see it's kind of a triangular shaped bracket. I'm going to lift it out. Oops. So that's going to come out, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put those bolts right back in to the bracket in the same orientation that they came out. That way I don't mess it up on reassembly, and it's all very clear to me how that thing is oriented and where each of the bolts go as they go back in, because they're different sizes. These are 15 millimeters. This is a 15mm long. These are 13mm shorts. This can't screw back into here, but I can put it back into its hole on top of the plenum. Okay. Okay, I've now separated the coil assembly that has the ignition wires on it from the intake plenum. And as you can see, there were 1, 2, 3, 4 10mm bolts that connected that coil assembly to the plenum. And I'm going to go ahead and bag those up and label the bag so I know where they go. And we're getting pretty close here. One of the things that still needs to be addressed, and is going to be a little bit problematic, and I know this from the last time I took this apart, is that there is a wire assembly that I believe connects to the alternator. So to the back of the alternator there's a couple of wires that hook up. They don't have to come off, but they are hooked right here to the back of this plenum, and so they're going to have to be they're hooked with some little kind of bracket things and some very small bolts, maybe 8mm bolts. They're going to have to be disconnected at some point for this plenum to come out. I might be able to unhook the plenum first from its mounting bolts, which you can see the mounting bolts are down here. There's one there, there's one there, there's one here, and there's one over here. We may be able to get that wire that's essentially hung on the back of the plenum. We may be able to get that off after we've got the plenum halfway out. It may be a little bit more accessible. Those bolts are kind of a pain back there. Okay, one of the things that has to be disconnected before the plenum will come out is this ground strap right here, which connects to the firewall. I'm not sure you can see it, but here's the ground strap, here's the firewall screw right here, and that connects down in here to the back of the plenum. And so that has to be disconnected before you can take the plenum out. So I've already loosened this screw. I'm going to back it out the rest of the way. And it's also got, I think, another ground strap on the same screw that goes to the alternator. So I'm going to try and just disconnect the one that I need to come off, which is this guy. Goes down there to the bottom of the plenum. And I'm going to leave the other wire, which actually was a grounding strap, looks like it went to an air conditioner connection, and I'm going to put the screw right back on where it came from so we don't lose it and don't have that other strap pop off. Okay. The plenum looks like it's pretty close to being ready to come off, so I'm just going to undo the 4 mounting holes, or 4 mounting bolts that connect it to the lower intake manifold. The nice thing about this job is it's going to be a dry job, meaning I'm not going to be opening up any water passages, so we don't have to drain the radiator fluid, don't have to drain oil, nothing like that. This is all dry. Water doesn't start being implicated until you get to the lower intake manifold, which is this thing down here, and that thing has water passages going through it. So if I was going to take that thing off, I would have to drain the radiator and probably also the engine oil. Okay, the intake plenum is almost ready to come out. You can see I've removed these end bolts that secure the plenum to the lower intake manifold. I've also excuse me, removed the stud bolts, or the stud nuts, from the 2 internal positions. And there's one more thing that has to come out, or has to be disconnected. There is a strut, a retaining strut, that connects the back of the intake plenum, sort of a support strut, to the rear head. And the nut for that is down in here. It is, let me use the silver end of this. It is right there. So I'm not sure that you can see in there, but it connects to the rear of the head. It's about a 14 millimeter nut. We're gonna have to take that off first. Okay, again, this is a shot of that support strut. I'm gonna try and illuminate it with a flashlight. And may or may not be able to see it. In there where it connects to the head. And so it actually was a 15 millimeter bolt, and I disconnected it pretty easily with a ratcheting box end. That's really the easiest way to do it. A ratcheting box end is one that has a rotational device inside the box end, so that you don't have to take it on and off the bolt. You can just crank it, crank it, crank it, and out it comes. Okay, I've now bagged that bolt, that 15mm bolt, and labeled it. Even though it's only one bolt, I've labeled it with rear plenum support strap. And very important to do that because it's just a single bolt, but this is easily the type of thing that you could get the entire project back together, have this unnamed bolt lying around extra on your workbench, and forget where it went to, because it is secreted in the back of the engine on the rear head, and so you don't want to forget to put that thing back in. It's a kind of a important support mechanism. Okay, I've got the intake plenum separated from the lower intake manifold, and while I had it in this position, I was able to access that cable that sort of tacked to the back of the plenum and undo the two 10mm bolts that were back there. That was going to hang it up and keep the plenum from coming off. I think the plenum's going to come out now. Okay, here's the intake plenum. These were the two bolts that connected that strap to the back of the plenum. And you can see back here, this is the strap that connected to the back of the plenum. There was also a connector right here that had to be disconnected. It connects to the rear oxygen sensor that goes to the exhaust manifold. And so now we've got the plenum out, and I can show you that support strap or support bracket that I had to disconnect that connected to the rear of the head. And so that's what the bottom of the intake plenum looks like. That's what the back of it looks like. And there you have the top, and there you have all the throttle body apparatus. So we're going to go ahead and store this thing now. Okay, there's the top of the engine with the intake plenum up and out of the way, and you can see how the plenum runners they go down into the lower intake manifold, and this intake manifold has water running through it, or at least through its water jackets, and so it's good that we don't have to take that out. But now you can see the rear fuel injectors. So there's fuel injector number 1, there's fuel injector number 3, there's fuel injector number 5, and number 1 here was the culprit. That was the one that was giving us the fault codes and the one we're going to replace. And but it may not be the only problem or the source of the problem. That fuel injector could be not functioning due to a wiring problem, and that could be a more difficult diagnostic situation. But basically you have this whole fuel rail which comes back along in here, and that supplies the fuel to each of the 6 fuel injectors. And then you have your wiring harness that connects to the wire connectors that the wiring harness fires the fuel injectors, or actually makes them open and close. This is a time of extreme danger for your engine with those open holes on the top of your intake manifold, and so you want to get those plugged up ASAP so that no bolts, no dirt, leaves, anything falls in there while your engine is exposed, because it would be virtually impossible to get that stuff out, especially if the bolt went all the way down into the head. Absent having some sort of flexible magnet or wand device, you really couldn't get it back out of there easily. You'd have to disassemble the top of the engine. So we're going to plug all those holes up with some paper towels. Okay, so you can see that I've plugged up the intake holes for the lower intake manifold to make sure no bolts or other debris falls down into my engine. And one of the things I think I've decided to do is I'd like a little bit more room over here. I'd like to be able to get this ignition module out of the way and have some more room to work with the fuel line and the fuel rail. And so I'm going to disconnect the rear ignition wires from the coil, the rear wires only. And you know, they say you should label all this and keep it straight, etc. But on this situation, it's actually very easy because there are numbers on the ignition coil for each of the wires. So number 1 ignition wire is labeled, number 5 ignition wire is labeled, number 5 ignition wire is labeled, and then number 1 ignition wire is labeled, and number 2 ignition or number 3 ignition wire is labeled on the where they go on the coil. And then you can see by tracing them from the back which one is which. So number 5 is way in back, number 3 is in the middle, number 1 is up front.